Okie dokie. Let's take a look at Gathering Storm, a prequel to A World at War. Well, I guess the first thing you notice when you start trying to actually do anything with this game is that it's not designed for a new player to learn in any sense of the word. The rulebook is, honestly, it may be the absolute worst rulebook I've ever had to try to learn from. I haven't looked at some of GMT's other failures. The worst rulebook where there's a game present. So, I often look at the game Popes and Princes and I say, I want to get a copy of that, but there's no game there. I'm not going to pay $30 for a tiny little folio of some game sketch ideas. Brilliant as they are, that the designer and developer never were able to make work, not just for publication, but they ended up having to port it over and make a computer game out of it to get it to even work vaguely. There's a working game here, I'm pretty sure. I mean, I played something so that and it felt like a reasonable game overall. But you don't get that idea from this rulebook. You don't get the idea that you have any concept of how things work. It's just given as an almost encyclopedic compendium of effects. And they add to their problem something I noticed late in the game in my investigation of the rules. They add to the problem with these overview sections that look like they're giving you rules, and sometimes are and sometimes aren't. As opposed to the general overviews that I'm used to, which usually say similar things, but they say them in a different format from the rest of the rules in enough of a way that it's obvious that you're not supposed to try to follow them. Here, by putting case numbers in the overview section, you just make the game harder to grasp for the average person coming from a wargaming experience who's used to the overview giving you a general overview in a kind of paragraph form and then the specific cases down below. I understand some reasons for that, but it goes so against the conventions of everything except maybe A World at War, which I believe does the same damn thing, and it confuses me there too, because it seems like they're repeating actual rules when actually what they're doing is they're repeating the rule, but they're also extending it a little bit elsewhere in a lot of the cases. So that's the first strike against it. And I don't think this rulebook works for anyone, right? It's not like a procedural rulebook that really goes into what you need to do in every case. It is really more of a, you already know how to play the game, and here's a dictionary of the little things you might need to look up. I didn't find it particularly good as even a lookup reference once I kind of figured out what I'm doing. It wasn't terribly bad, it's just, it was a so-so reference, mainly because nothing sticks in your head from reading it. And what you can't do is you can't read these rules and kind of have an idea of the game. And you can read the rules to World in Flame and kind of understand how things are going. There might be some subsystems that you're like, geez, I need to get that on the map and start playing. Well, that's the other way people tend to learn war games, right? Or complex games, is they want to push some pieces around. I think there's basically two main styles of learning. I'm the read the rule book, get most of the idea, jump in, and catch up with what I have. Other people are, let's screw around with the subsystems, let's push some pieces around, and let's kind of learn by doing. There may be other ways, there may be the, and maybe that works here, I don't know. But yeah, so the problem with learning by doing in this game is that there's no easy way to set it up. With what comes in the box, setup is buried in every single rule section. You have to go through the rules of the book to find the setup. Every single section has its own little setup section. Has its own little setup like description in there. Maybe some aren't there. I'm not sure. What I had to do was I had to download some text off the internet that gets you a start. Somebody has kind of done the work of extracting everything from here and trying to set it up and trying to make it work. They don't go into quite enough detail, but they do give you enough to get some idea of how you might set this game up, because there isn't anything anywhere. I think the assumption was you can figure it all out from the player aids. And if you already know how to set up the game, these can do quite a bit towards getting you there. But they're not enough. There are things you still have to extract from the rules. You still have to try to figure out. So basically what you're doing is you're extracting from the rules and extrapolating from this card to try to figure out how the game actually gets set up. These cards aren't completely obvious either. And that's the other issue, is that they give you tons of player aids with the hint that they're going to be very, very useful. And maybe they are. I mean, the game would be impossible without them since you play it on them. But then you've got things like this research result garrison, which I guess comports to this. There's no counter for that. And you're just kind of, you're left with this, I don't know what's going on with this. You know, I can kind of make a guess. I can make a pretty good guess of what's meant by it. But there's essentially nothing to record that on the sheet. And it's not at all something that translates to the person who hasn't set it up and played before. So I guess what I have to say about the rules and the player aids is that they're so-so in terms of not confusing you too much and still allowing you to play if you already know the game and have had somebody teach you. If you're using it out of the box to try to learn from, I honestly don't know if there's a worse rule book. The thing is, I don't know that there's any real mistakes in it. There's a few minor little things. Every rule book has a few things. It's just that it's set up so that I don't think anyone can learn from it. Which is terrible. Because the purpose of a rule book, the main purpose, is to present the rules so that to someone who doesn't know them already. You don't refer to your rule book in chess ever. Now this, because it is a somewhat more complex game, does have that additional reference status that, you gotta look things up. This isn't as complicated a game as a World at War. Not by a long shot. Yet this rule book makes it feel harder to learn and, frankly about as hard to find because there's no index or anything in it. In addition to the rule book, you need something that is a pure dictionary, which is the battle manual, which gives you the effects of all kinds of stuff. Now those effects are hinted at in the rules, but not, and usually correctly expressed, but not always. Not always is all of it noted in here, most especially in the not the random events. The research values, but they're not in here. They're in the rule book, actually. They're in their own section. So yeah, I guess everything's actually mentioned, but there's no real clear link to a counter. This gives you a link to a counter. Not all counters are in here, though. Not all counter types. There are a few that you kind of stand there and say, hey, what do I do with this? And there are also cases where it tells you to put a counter somewhere that isn't referenced in here and that maybe doesn't exist in the game. And you really kind of throw your hands out. That all makes the setup harder. You can find something to use for it, but it just really kind of confuses things. And a lot of the game is trying to figure out what counter to use for what. And again, as you play it more, you start to learn, that's what those are for. I see. But it's not really clearly spelled out, even with a whole booklet that's used for graphical images, and several pages are used to describe some of the counters. Likewise, the research charts contain all kinds of little numbers in them that pertain to A World at War, and then others that don't, and that only pertain to A World at War. Others that don't seem to pertain to either game. And there also seems to be some presentation issues here where, there are values that don't work in the translation system, which I undertook, and they don't work directly in Gathering Storm, and I'm just... And then they're also inconsistent, and that's very, very much like A World at War, where, everything in the game... Well, not everything, but there are several different competing ways of handling things that seem very similar. There could be much smoother and streamlined methods of handling things. I know Unconditional Surrender, Axis Empires has some of this, but nowhere near as much. But Unconditional Surrender, World in Flames, these things have much more comprehensive ways of presenting something, and then, there are modifiers. Here, instead, they throw you a whole new chart or whatever when it's essentially the same as the one that everybody else uses, but they stack it differently. Again, that may be a taste issue, but it certainly there's a lot of bloat in this game in terms of rulebooks, in terms of components, in terms of player rates, and then the work hasn't been done to make that bloat manageable at all. All right. Components themselves, largely pretty good. I know some people complain about the single-sided white counters. Largely that's okay. There are a few cases where there should be double-sided counters, though. There are counters that are just positive that seem to be meant to be used on tracks where they go positive or negative. It would be nice if you could flip it over, get a negative value. But this conformance to, hey, A World at War uses single-sided counters with white paper on the back that stains really easily, so we should do that too. One good thing about gloss on the counters, and I gotta say, I don't mind the matte on the back of the counters because it actually makes them better to stack. So I'm not going to complain too much about that, but I know some people will. I do have some badly stained counters. I have a burned one too. I must have dropped a burning ash on it while I was clipping, because it happened in my clipping. Anyway, the counters are fairly decent. Standard GMT quality. Problem with that, of course, is A World at War has much, much smaller, much thinner counters. So this could be a positive or a negative. The military units you add from Gathering Storm will be a different quality than the counters that you use on A World at War. On the other hand, there'd be no way to tell them apart, really, to tell which ones belong in which game. Well, one of the best ways to tell, because they aren't duplicates of other counters, is by the thickness of the counter. You can very quickly and tactily tell. And I don't see them as causing too much trouble. I've played with more counter thickness difference and, like little pieces of paper added to games and stuff. So I don't think it's going to be a huge deal to have different thickness counters when we play. We'll see. The only issue I have with the components, and it's kind of a funny one, is with the cards. Now these feel like, in a lot of ways, the GMT cards I like. Very flexible, easy to shuffle. They seem like they're going to be fairly sturdy. I had some chipping happen to them. They were very hard to pick up off the table, and got a nasty paper cut off one of them. I mean, really nasty. Like, it was just bleeding right away. That kind of disturbed me. I almost want to put sleeves on these so I don't hurt myself. And also, they do get damaged pretty quickly compared to most other games. There may be other GMT games that have some like this. I'm shuffling such a big deck that maybe I'm seeing issues that I wouldn't see otherwise. course, the armored box. Okay, what about gameplay itself? Well, let me take a look at the sequence of play. You know what? Let me swap out batteries. Okay. Let's take a look at our sequence of play here. So, one thing that I really like is the random events in this. That's something that I feel, is missing from the other games that I have on pre-World War II. It's really cool to have something that drives the play in the sense of outside events that the players aren't controlling. And it's especially important in this because you're not rolling dice, you're mainly just comparing things. So having some kind of randomizer in this is very nice. The determination of income is going to be combined with how rich your country is in terms of civilian production, mixed with how militaristic you are in terms of support. And the more military factories you build, the more support you get. So you get kind of you're able to militarize and still have money for diplomacy, more militarization, and research. But the longer you can keep your civilian production going, the better off you are overall. This seems a little strange to me, except that they want to create a balance and, an actual choice here. Because the truth is, nothing spurred research, for example, the way World War II did. And nothing really spurred diplomatic alignment the way the actual build-up to war did. In a way that feels a little different from what the game presents. Take that as good or bad in terms of game choices. If you didn't have this mechanism in place, well, there would be one thing to do: militarize. So I guess what you can say is that you're not really making the choice between just militarizing and civilian production. You're making the choice between keeping some of your effort towards these not building up straight army units. And it's also important because building navies comes from your income. So keeping your civilian production up actually keeps your income high. However you want to look at that, there may be a little bit of, I'm not sure how much sense that makes, but okay. Now I cheated a little in my play, but in fact I may have cheated more than I think. Yeah, there's only one per turn, not one per turn. Okay. In terms of bonusing the Russians, and they kind of came out they didn't come out very well, so I can't feel too badly about doing so. But you have this economic phase where you make the choice whether you want to turn one of your factories either into, if it's idle, into civilian or military, or if it's idle or civilian, into a military factory, and gain the the advantages accrued there. This is a very expensive choice, and at the beginning of the game, you don't have a lot of money. You build it up pretty quickly, but also these conversions are very expensive. They get very cheap later in the game as tensions go up and everything. One weird thing about the random events, though, if you have secret ones, you're able to kind of hold them, and they'll take effect eventually, but you can keep them from being revealed to other people until they have to be revealed, essentially. Other ones are open, which are revealed immediately, and everybody kind of has a hand on it. Most of the secret ones are going to be positive for you, but they're not all. Some of them are negative, and it's kind of weird to have the, oh yeah, I've got negative income, but I don't have to show it until later. I think it's a cute mechanism, but it could be confusing to teaching. The other thing is some players can get more than one. You get a bonus when you conduct aggressions, or for the Allies, once things go beyond a certain place, they just start getting a cumulative bonus in cards, which kind of puts a time limit on the game. That is the timer. And if you have more than one random event, you only must play one, but you may play as many as you like, which is kind of funky. It does mean that you're able to avoid bad events very easily. yet still get some additional good effects. Okay, getting back. So you do the factory conversion, and this is all done secretly. This is your economic phase where you're picking things up. You do research. Now the research system is similar to, but not the same as the World at War one. You basically invest points, and here, instead of rolling dice on tables to see what you get and triggering the results and all, you just kind of invest them. Once you get to a place where a result takes place, you record that. And here's where the game is really tricky, is that it's not always, I wasn't able to quickly discern what the effect was. Basically, you can look it up in the rules and see what the effect is, but it's not always clear. So for example, things like, most things have a result on the 6 box, but something like air defense, and that result is essentially, in the Gathering Storm terms, to put a counter over on your support chart. Well, in the air defense and air range, there is no result listed, but at the 5th box, which is not marked at all, and the 10th box, which is marked with a, I don't know, something that indicates that you're going to be getting a bonus in the final round in your research over at a World at War, but it's in a strange color that kind of indicates, hey, this has some effect. I would probably look that up. So the 5th box is the real problem here, because it's got nothing in it, and you actually get a support marker off of that. So there's some problems with these, and there are other problems as well. I just wanted to point that one out because that one's particularly disturbing. But there are problems with numbers in there that don't have any effect as far as I can tell, and that leaves you. So one of two things is happening: either they have an effect and I haven't found it, and that's always my worry, or they waste my time looking for it and there's no damned effect there at all. Anyway, so what you do is you assign points to this. You've got a set of points. You've got restrictions as to where you can assign them, who you can assign them to. And you pretty much can assign one per project. And you're trying to achieve certain results to move counters over onto these balance of power charts, which then will generate modifiers which go to the overall balance of power. And it is mechanically somewhat simple once you get, once you're doing the bookkeeping. It's mechanically simple if you knew what the things were, and it actually gives a nice visual representation. So the concept behind it works. It's just the implementation of the description of it and making it easier to grasp what you're supposed to do when isn't well done, and could probably use some changes to the research chart and, some rules to explain what the hell you're doing, because there aren't any. Okay, and then the final thing is you're allowed to build units. Now, buildings, a lot of the stuff in this game is triggered off of these kind of big square counters, which are your activity counters. Building factories doesn't seem to have any relationship to them. All you have to do is pay money, which are these other big things which are called tiles. These are not, I guess. These are called activity counters. But these tiles are essentially money, and they have some rules about them that seem a little strange. But honestly, from what I can tell, you use them like money. And you can make change with them out of the bank, etc. So I don't know. I don't know why they're, specified values, except that you put a pool of them together in a cup, and you get some random income from them. You get a draw each turn. You buy activity markers using these tiles. You can also pay for these tiles to do factory conversions. For the most part, these activity counters then are going to restrict what you can do. You can't just spend all your money on anything. So most of your tiles seem to be multi-purpose, but you have some of them that are devoted to only one thing. And they kind of help define your national characteristics. So like, you're only allowed to use one general usage tile for research, which I forgot about during the first part of my game, although I had played it that way when I screwed around before I actually started this, because this is one of the few games where I couldn't even think about what the rules were until I got it playing. And I couldn't get it playing from what was packaged in the game. It's like this catch-22 that's just horrible. But if you want to build units, for example, you have to use 2 activity points. And they have to be general usage for this. If you want to build ships, you have to use a certain amount of activity points, and you also have to relate that to your shipbuilding track. Now, this shipbuilding track is very simple for someone who has read A World at War and played with the shipbuilding track there, but it's probably a complex idea for somebody new to this game. So that's something to particularly look at. I didn't really look at the rules on that, so I don't know how effective they are. I did spend some effort to figure that out in A World at War. Because it's not intuitive. One of the things is, whatever month it is, or whatever season it is, that's the only season that you can trigger movement on. And you can pay to move it down, or you can slide it over to the next month so that you have a choice to pay later. You also have a limit to how many ships you can have currently building. And in terms of activity counters, you can use shipbuilding counters on this along with regular ones. But you must use a shipbuilding counter if you're laying down a new ship. Just all kinds of little things there. And then after you do all this secretly, the industrial factory conversion, the research points, the units that you're building, and set aside the activity tiles that you're spending for this, and paid your activity counters, even though they look just like tiles, and paid the tiles to buy those counters, and also for the factories, then you discard them. There's spaces on the map board that you put your discards in. Not really too necessary, but it does provide a place where everybody can look and see what you have. Then you go to a diplomatic facet of the game. And for the most part, what people do is they buy activity tiles, and some are limited to diplomacy only, although they don't say that on the back, so that's kind of weird. So it's hard to tell which ones are and aren't. So you've got to constantly be doing lookups, or just try to figure out and say, well, I'm good with this. I'll pretend that I understand what's going on. You buy those tiles, and you place them. Now those are placed in turn order but face down. So the Germans place one tile first, plus any military pressure and anti-Comintern pressure. Then the Italians, then the then the Russians, then the Western Allies. But the Germans and Italians only have to place one counter. Everybody else has to put all their counters down. So then the Germans and Italians get a free, essentially, last turn to put everything else down that they want to do. They still have to buy the counters. It's not free in any sense. It's just that they get to see where everybody else has gone. They don't get to see how much they've gone. They also don't get to see the secret events that are sitting around that will influence some of these effects. And then these are just matched up in kind of a one-for-one basis, although there's other rules in place for this, especially to deal with Russia, who can't do much diplomacy, to be honest. And they cancel each other out, and you're trying to swing to get a diplomatic modifier, a certain number of flags in the country. Once you get 3 flags, it starts affecting your income. Then you do the crisis phase. And in the crisis phase, the Axis is able to essentially try to take over a space. They can take 1 per turn maximum. And what's really going to affect you here is making a count of who can declare war on me. Because if no one can possibly declare war on you, and you do this as a count of balance of power, combined support levels for the different nations, and the defensive value of the minor country that you're trying to take. Now, that defensive value is modified by surrounding minor countries, by your diplomacy on that minor country. So if you're really heavily diplomatically aligned with that country, you want to invade it, or something like that. I don't know. Anyway, once you calculate out this, and it's really just, as far as I can tell, although the rules don't explain this at all, except for the Russians in one case, it's really just a comparison of the two values. And if the Allied power has more total value in pertaining to that minor country than the Axis power, there is one random draw to add to the minor country's defensive strength, then the Allies will be able to declare war. And you have this whole process of playing chicken, which, as far as I'm concerned, it comes down to, you can calculate most of it out. Now, there are some cards that might be hidden that affect it as well. You can calculate most of it out, and then once you decide you're going to war, you're not going to do a Munich. You're not going to make an ultimatum and then pull back. That's just stupid. If you want to go, you go, right? However, you can be forced into a Munich, which is to say you flip over all the events and you don't have enough points to declare war anymore. So there are some steps in the declaration of war in this crisis phase that seem superfluous. No player is going to back down at that point, I think, but they do give you an option for the Axis to pull back once an ultimatum is made or whatever. You also have the opportunity after this to make a preemptive declaration of war. Chances are that's stupid until you get to the very end of the game and find out that, hey, there will be no more aggressions and we need to start a war because we want to get the main game going, or because the situation is going to deteriorate from where we are. All right. Victory conditions. They end up being basically a comparison of the military situation that's going to project over to a world at war, the territories conquered, and stuff like that. And you're really it ends up a point salad, but it's a sensible one, right? If you're just playing Gathering Storm as a standalone game, because of that point salad nature, it kind of feels like a Euro. A thematic Euro in the sense that, the victory conditions and the actions you take all make sense. But most of the play of the game doesn't really feel like a wargamey type thing, as opposed to Days of Decision, which feels very much like a wargame. More along the lines of Origins of World War II, but much, much more complex. Largely because of the rules being difficult to cope with. But it's still, Origins of World War II is this tiny little, very light game. For the translation itself, you're going to basically be going through all your results. The force pool you created, the research you've done, etc. And with all that in mind, Gathering Storm still feels like you played this massively complex Euro, but it also feels like you've got this goal in mind that really makes it worth doing, right? In the same sense that every time I play Origins of World War II, I'd think, wow, could I make that, like my precursor to Third Reich? Could I play Third Reich after this based on it? And I always said, nah, there's just not enough. I'd have to change so much, I'd have to make up so much. So it's got me kind of excited about getting back to a world at war, although I may do something short in between. And, overall, my feeling is it's not such a bad game. It's not a bad game in and of itself. There is one issue in the play that really worried me, which is that it's possible to get handcuffed. I ended up making maybe some bad decisions with the Allies, and the Germans completely controlled the game. I'm not sure whether or not that can go the other way, but the bad decisions were ones that felt reasonable. Basically, you're playing this game of chicken in terms of how many factories you mobilize from civilian factories into military. If you get your civilian factories up, you make lots of income. If you use too many of them up, you don't have enough money to influence the game anymore. If the other guy has many, many more of them than you, he can influence the game. We basically came to one turn where the Allies moved factories over to military factories, civilian factories to military factories. And they lost enough income, and it's only a couple points there, that the proportion of the income, because the Germans especially didn't move things, became such that the Germans could kind of control the diplomacy everywhere. They were also able to buy more research. They just got control of the game, ran away from it, and ran the table. And because of that amount of money, because they could influence and buy more research and play with the balance of power and buy more units and play with the balance of power, the Allies could never declare war. So they were militarized, they were, in this position where they were close to declaring war, but the thing that was preventing them from doing so was really the diplomatic situation. I don't see a way around that except by being good at the game. Understanding the game well enough that you don't get caught in that situation. On the other hand, it's going to put me into an interesting world at war situation. And it doesn't look like it totally screws a world at war, because the better the Germans do, the closer the U.S. is to coming into the game. The problem is, a world at war is going to be judged on how long the Axis survive. And we're starting the game in 41 with the Axis fairly far along. Although they still have to take out France, and France has a bigger army than they would have otherwise. So we'll see how that plays out. In terms of playing Gathering Storm itself, though, it was a blowout. I mean, I could have quit at any point and said, well, this is an obvious Axis victory. I'm not so sure that it's going to translate as strongly over to a world at war. Moreover, a world at war is balanced as a game, but biased against the Axis in terms of the war as a whole, which I believe is, fair. I don't believe the Axis had a chance, especially the Germans in Europe. Especially the Japanese, but the Germans in Europe, I don't believe they had a chance either. I believe Russia probably could have handled them on their own. Probably not the case if you just play the game, but wow, Anyway, overall, if they reworked the game, made rules that people could understand and read, made play aids that worked, I would fairly recommend this game to everyone. Anyone who wants a really complex game on this subject, or a fairly complex game on this subject, I think it's fun enough to play. I think there's some really interesting factors in it. The other side of it, though, is if you have a world at war and you really want a scenario generator for it, this is still probably worth it, even with all the problems in it. Look, it takes a certain amount of effort to figure out a world at war, right? I mean, if you're already an addict to that game, you can afford the effort involved in this. Just don't expect it to be proportional. The effort involved in this is not all that much less than the effort involved in learning a world at war. But once you spend it, once you know the game, like I said, the rules book as a reference, the player aids, probably aren't that bad once you actually have already learned the game. I felt like I was processing pretty well. I made some errors of omission because there's just all these little things. You have to know all kinds of things that get triggered. Here's another thing. It's not just the things I pointed out, the event cards. They don't express everything that they could as well as they could. There would be very easy ways to put Civil War events, to put some little icon on them to say this is a Civil War event. Of course, the rule book wouldn't bother explaining that icon. You'd have to figure it out on your own, but that's okay. At least the icon's there, and you would eventually maybe put together why that's there. I was playing the game and had no idea what the Civil War events were. I went through, maybe a Yugoslav event or whatever. Then I realized it's anything that mentions that country. Okay, great, That's weird, right? All right, anyway. As far as I'm concerned, the rule book, the play aids, the playability for a first-time player, this is an unmitigated disaster and does not deserve this GMT label on it. It doesn't deserve it. GMT should never make this mistake again. They should, essentially what I understand what they did is they handed this over to Bruce Harper and said, do what you want with it. But he probably demanded that right. They should never allow this to another designer. I mean, I don't care. Unless they're like handing it to, George Lucas for a Star Wars game as ultimate, design consultant or whatever. That's just guaranteed to make them, huge money. I'm sorry, a World at War is not going to make that kind of money. And put someone in as a developer. Make sure the game gets blind tested. There is no way this went out to people who, and it's trying to be sold as such, or was, to people who have never played a World at War. Not that it helps you terribly much, but at least gives you a strong incentive for learning this. It never went out to people who never played a World at War and weren't babysat and taught the game. It never was sufficiently blind tested, and that's just a problem. Whatever the game is, this is not an expansion to a World at War. If it was only going to be that, if it was only going to be available as a World at War expansion, some leeway, not as much as this takes in terms of presenting the game, because this is hell for World at War players as well, because it's completely new rules and done much, much worse. I never looked at the first edition of the original Third Reich. I've heard that it's a nightmare. I challenge it with this, although that had rules mistakes. I don't know if there's much in the way of mistakes in this, but who the hell cares about mistakes if you can't understand the rules? Mistakes are easy. You can look at it and say, that's a mistake, cross it out and put it in if you have an errata in front of you. If you have living rule books, it becomes harder. Living rule books are a fucking mess because people don't keep a change log of everything, that you have to write into it. So you have to compare the rule books side by side, essentially. Anyway, I would suggest if you do not own a World at War, pass on this until and unless all the player aids and rule books are rewritten. If you need a physical copy of these things with your game, if you expect your game to come complete, wait until the never to happen reprint, or wait until GMT, maybe buckles to pressure. See if they do, as they have in a couple of other games, which they've screwed up. This one is, I didn't see what they did to Supreme Commander, but this one is probably worse than One by the Sword, which they rewrote the rules for, or are rewriting the rules for and reissuing them. This is, as far as I'm concerned, unplayable out of the box. You need someone to hold your hand. You need to find someone online who, I don't know. Conceivably, you could rewrite you could write the starting stuff and work it out. It would take you a long time, but it's like a development task. It's not something that you should be expected to do. It's something that the game's developer should have done. Unfortunately, Mr. Harper decided that they didn't need a developer. He, the designer, would be the project manager and would run everything and make sure that the game, make sure that any questions, if they did send it out to blind testing, any complaints about, wow, this doesn't even make sense, would be written off to, okay, well, those were bad blind testers. Let's send it out to a World at War people who really, really want to make this work. Or let's send it out only to people who, I've held their hand while they tried to figure out how to play the game. Or people on my little special Yahoo group who are discussing it all the time and therefore have come to a groupthink and an understanding of it. Well, if you're not one of those people, this ain't the game for you. So, if you're in the Yahoo group, go buy it. Otherwise, you will probably be very, very disappointed. with the rulebook. Even if you're a World at War player, you may want to pass on this. Unless you really, really want a Europe-only prequel. There's no reason it couldn't have been Pacific as well, and that pisses me off as well. I may raise my rating. Right now I've got it sitting around 3 because, like I said, it's an unplayable disaster from the start. But once you can get the rules, it's okay. There's this, I mean, it's a good game. But there is this huge disappointment about not covering the Pacific in it as well. I mean, when I ordered it, I thought it would cover the Pacific. My fault for not reading that. You know, I don't do research, right? All right, let's send this out.